Next up, we've got Alan Gray, who's going to cover some aspects of growing pains from a Nelson perspective. Alan is a principal landscape architect with Bofema School here in Whakatū. He has led award-winning public realm delivery outcomes in the US and here in Aotearoa, including the development and adoption of Te Ara o Whakatū, Nelson's central city vision. Alan will focus on the opportunities growing pains can represent to New Zealand's regional centres with aligned and bold thinking to recover and reconnect to Nelson's urban identity. Please welcome Alan Gray.
Thanks, Henry. Good to see you again. And welcome to Whakatū. My name is Alan, and up until about 3 months ago, I was working within Nelson City Council and the city development team to try to articulate a way forward for the city centre and how that might be achieved. So the quote on the board now is from Ernest Rutherford. He's from Nelson. And he went on to become the first person to split the atom. He's the father of nuclear physics. So part of that quote is, and this is a reflection of being in a small center, so unlike Bangkok of 15 million people, Whakatū Nelson's 50,000, there's a different scale at which city centers need to function and operate and compete when you're smaller. And so you may not have the big budgets that metro centers might have or that those councils might bestow back to doing public realm type work. So you've got to be innovative. So this presentation will sort to look at some of that. And we look at Nelson's an old settlement within Aotearoa. I think it's the oldest settlement on the South Island and probably one of the first three within the overall country. And this is a map from, I think, 1842. And that history and those sort of meanings, that sort of identity of this place is really unique. And part of the aspect of growing pains within Nelson Whakatū is we know change is going to come. And there is pressure in that space, but we also need to hold on to our identity. And I think within the city centre, that's an important thing. And I think Nelson has this sort of tremendous legacy. We introduced rugby to New Zealand. I mean, it's almost a spiritual sort of move, I suppose, and it has the oldest rugby club in the country. The Bishop Suter Art Gallery was one of the first 3 museums established within New Zealand. And Warren O'Mani and council and others contributed to the expansion of that. And I really sort of suggest if delegates have a spare hour or a half hour, go over and visit that facility. It's amazing. Within science and research, and the Cawthorn Institute is one of the country's top kind of independent science organizations looking at specific things around marine and freshwater ecology, sustainable fishing methods, and they work quite closely within lots of branches of the industry. And this is their formal facility on the edge of the city center. And Thomas Cawthorn himself was a huge benefactor to the city. The steps at the base of the cathedral were part of a donation, and he also sort of lent money to the council in the early days. Some of that might have been to create even the area we're at today. So his legacy in the community is tremendous, and the Cawthorn Institute, I think, just celebrated their centennial last year. So they're still a really critical part of the community. And we recognize change does happen. This is the cathedral, I think, around the time of the First World War. And then how it obviously exists today, and I'm sure that delegates from the conference will hopefully spend some time there. And these steps are really the heart of this city center. This is where people sit and have lunch and enjoy. It's where hikoi and protests will happen, and climate change protests with all of our secondary schools all come out onto these steps, and it's a really powerful sort of experience. And then things that we founded in Nelson, the World of Wearable Art by Dame Susie Moncrief, I think it was in the late 80s, and it stayed in Nelson until 2005, and then it's since moved to Wellington. And we need to recognize that small regional centers like Nelson can innovate and create things, but sometimes it's hard to hold on to them. They become really successful and popular, and the size of the city can only go so far into that. There was a museum, I think, that's just outside of town, that it was shared between the World of Wearable Art and a car museum, but I think it's all a car museum now. So we're starting to lose more and more of that sort of that memory. And I think that's an important thing within the sort of growing pains, is that we know that cities do need to grow and move on. Things may need to scale up in other places, but you don't want to sort of lose that sort of identity, and I think that's a challenge. And we look at how, if we think about sort of age projections, this is for the country of New Zealand. I'm sorry, this is worked with an analyst in our city development team, and he likes doing these graphs. This is for the country of New Zealand, looking over the next several decades, and the projections are basically between ages of 14 and 65, the orange and the gray lines. That's where a lot of that sort of growth is going to be, although the yellow line you see at the bottom is growing faster, which that's the over 65s. In Nelson, that over 65's overtaken everything. So what we're finding, I think, in Nelson, in terms of our growing pains, and probably maybe more in the greenfields than in the city center, but people are retiring, they're cashing out of the metro areas, and they're coming here. We have great weather, it's a beautiful sort of place to live. But there are challenges with having to create cities that will work for your aging population, and also obviously rating, tax rates and things like that, how you collect that. Part of creating a city vision is collecting a hell of a lot of data. You know, I kind of came into the role in 2018, and the council was like, let's go build this street, let's do that. And I mentioned, like, we really need to kind of take a pause and collect data. And this is some interesting things that we've pulled out of it. Within the sort of central city of Nelson, almost 6,000 workers, 8,000 students, including at a polytech, only 100 residents within that same area. It's kind of shocking. Great hospitality, there's good museums, close to great mountain biking, close to everything. Nobody's living here. A lot of people live within 5 kilometers, so you can think maybe people can get in alternative means, but a lot of people still insist on driving. So a lot of the drive for looking at our city center is how can we build it more for people living here. You get more people living here, then the shops will extend open, it feels safer because there's more activity on the streets. We also measure a lot of stuff, and this is, I credit Peter Olorenshaw, who's an architect locally, and Nelsus, who are really good advocates in the active mode space for transport. And when we were in the kind of early days of Te Whakatu, I had digitized the city center and found, I was interested, how much of the city is building coverage, how much of it is footpaths, how much of it is open space, how much of it is streets and parking. And you can see by this yellow figure ground, 44% of the city center is streets and car parks, surface car parks. That is a lot. Only 42% of the city is covered in buildings. So we have an excess of, well, you can see here the yellow space, the street and the parking. The parking, surface parking alone is 28%. That's a lot of area dedicated to storing vehicles. And then you can also see in the sort of structure of Whakatu, those big yellow blocks that are kind of these big parking squares in the interior of the city, they kind of hide the cars, I suppose, but they create these really long blocks. The blocks are about 200 meters long. So I generally find that a lot of your social interactions, the things that the people you bump into often happen at intersections. And with big blocks, you have less of those. And that was something we thought was worthy of looking at as well. Collecting the data. So we've worked with Jan Gale and through Den Aiken at Urban Good. So he's been trained in that methodology for the last, I don't know, 10 or 15 years. Worked closely with Den, and his office is in Blenheim. And we did public life in 2019 and 2020. And Nelson's a pretty small city to look at applying that methodology, but we got a lot of good information. So we had about 30 different locations we looked at. And the key findings of this is that and we did it in summer and winter, the summers are about 40% busier than the winters. I think restaurants on 2 or 3 good months in the summer can pretty much make what they need for the year. And some will kind of close up the shop. And as a city, we really want those restaurants to stay open through the winter. And we'll talk a little bit about how we try to encourage that. The other thing we found is that our central street, Trafalgar Street, carries half of all of our pedestrian movements. And the key block right in the middle between Bridge Street and Hardy Street carries a quarter of all the pedestrian movements. So we started looking at that data. We started to look at how outdoor life in terms of outdoor seating at restaurants, and you can clearly see one street in one area seems to have the aggregate of that. So how does that start to inform a plan for your city? We've looked at sort of different age demographics of people who are part of that public life, and we can see that obviously the middle area, the sort of middle-aged people like myself are a big part of that. But how do we deal to the young people and the people that are aged? We want them coming out of their Somerset developments and coming into the city and being part of that experience. And one thing we found really interesting in that collection of data, and it's in the bottom of the center there, less than 0.05% of all those sort of registrations of public use in the city were for children at play. And so in response to that, I created a tactical panel, and we worked with NZILA and Canopy at the time to create this pop-up playground right next to the library. And this was successful, and it was good, and it was obviously overly conspicuous with the color. We worked with Wakatu Incorporated, who owned the land, and there was even the red path as a vestige of how some of the Waka and even later colonial arrivals came into the city, and some of them were actually registered. Can you guys, it's a bit annoying. I can try to carry on. I don't know if you can hear me or not. It's a bit hard, I think. So, all right. Anybody have a headache? This was a good first move. It didn't really achieve all the objectives. We had a planning conference, the New Zealand Institute of Planning, had a conference here in that brief moment between the two COVID lockdowns. And there was a delegation of high school students who were from the top of the South here. And I took them on a tour of the city, and we ended here. And we had lunch, and there was some discussion about this particular place. And, you know, there were teenage girls who were like, there's nothing here for me. We didn't provide enough shade. So over time, we've tried to look at modifying that installation. And that'll probably be around for another year or two. So, but the idea is that, and I'll come to it later, is that there is a central city kind of play facility. We've looked at ways of trying to change some of our city blocks. Top of Trafalgar Street, which is at the base of the Cawthron Steps, is a relatively short block. It's about 80 meters long. There's a bit of heritage on it. And because of its relationship with Picky Mine and the church steps, we did 2 years of summer trials closing that off, doing some activation in there, and then we were able to create a small pedestrian mall. I'm not particularly a proponent of pedestrian malls, but in this context, it works quite well. I do call it a people place, and of course, this photo doesn't show any people, but I'll come back to that. And you know, we worked with Land Lab on the creation of the feature lights, and this was actually an evening when we were testing those, so it was not really a time when we were doing anything in there. And then all of that work has led to the sort of creation of our city vision, Te Ara Whakatu. And there were sort of 8 key actions in this sort of tree of that vision, I suppose. And the first one is around great places, identifying that you would like to have a node, a place, a spot, a little park, probably about every 100 meters or 150 meters in the city, and how we can try to identify those opportunities. And possibly a new vision for that Upper Trafalgar that really forms a clear, legible extension to the base of the church steps, and it prioritizes that pedestrian movement over the kind of bifurcation of a small arterial roadway that crosses over it. So we're interested further in how we can kind of create that. And we worked on these quick little visualizations just with some local talent here in Whakatū. So really proud of the team. So that was Art House Architects, Den Aiken, and Kenny Dukatat, who will be talking this afternoon. The second action is around sort of these legible precincts in our city. And some of those are kind of organically growing, and some are emerging. There was a great opportunity here right on the edge of the river to create a new library, a climatorium, working across with academics and researchers in Denmark. So there'd be a northern and southern hemisphere sort of study place. And we'll come back to this project in a minute, but this started to create a great sort of a new framework that brings the city right into the river. There's a Burger King currently on that kind of corner where the kind of diagonal access into the river, and setting up a view corridor through that sort of framework too. So that precinct, I think, has a tremendous opportunity, but there are obviously concerns about flood risks being in that kind of close proximity. Another action is around people at play. It's not necessarily playgrounds and young kids. It's about how play can be incorporated in kind of everyday movements, whether it's morning boot camps or our aged residents coming into the city for lunch, places where youth, when they come out of school at 3 o'clock, can sort of feel like they can nest and perch in the city. And the image on the screen is a little bit of a sort of tactical version of that to test it. But there are ideas about a play space. I've worked with the council to acquire a piece of land that's currently a very hostile bus depot. And there are thoughts of they're going to do a new bus interchange in a really sort of designated facility right on the edge of the city, and that this space could become part of a new play space for all ages in association with the Bridge Street Linear Park. Another action is around seeing ourselves, both in public art, but also working with iwi and other people so that there's a sense of what our place is. It isn't imported in from Vancouver or from Auckland. It is something that is Whakatū, and this idea of this Poe forest on the old Maori tents land in Albion Square that we would need to work with the Department of Conservation, that becomes a real destination, and there could be some really strong narrative in that, and that becomes an extension of a cultural lane link that continues through the city, and vestiges of that Poe forest start to extend out. The idea of this linked up laneways is quite important, coming back to that earlier slide with all the yellow squares. How can we find other ways to move people through the city, not just on footpaths, but through different types of laneways and different types of connections? And Church Street might be an opportunity. It's kind of a quirky little place right next to Upper Trafalgar, some really cool coffee shops. I think it's our only Mexican restaurant. And how that can become more of a place that complements something like Upper Trafalgar, but with a different kind of identity and a different type of vibe. Greener streets, so there's the intention that we do need to get more trees in our city center. There's not a lot of them. I think there's something like 64. Some of them are getting quite old. And the idea within the plan is to get 1,000 new trees right within the city center. And this is really in anticipation of more people living here. And that gets to the next action around raising residents. How do we have people part of our city center? Not 74 or the 100 that live here now, but 2,000. And so part of that is how do we shift this sort of view of getting out of a single family house in a greenfield to living in intensity in the city? And of course, Auckland and Wellington, Christchurch are doing these projects. They are much more challenging here. We don't have quite the developer or contractor skills necessarily. The land is really expensive. And probably the biggest driver is the market isn't ready to live in apartments. But given that we have this growth of age population, I think there's a great opportunity there. And then I think the proposition of working with Kainga Ora, which is central government's sort of housing team, working with them and the council to look at land that's sort of surplus, but could be basically sold and then developed for social and affordable housing. So these are a couple projects that are in discussion now. The last action is around Streets for People. I know it's kind of an overlap with the Waka Kotahi program, but the idea is that if we can work within the 3 main streets in our city center, refocus those around people, still keep some access, maybe keep a little bit of parking, but let those parking squares do that job, and you can start to create a range of different sort of opportunities in the city center. And this is sort of the last slide here on the Bridge Street Linear Park. This is a big project. You probably would have seen it on Getz. This is the thinking early on as a one-way street with a lot of green, a lot of people and place function. And we took this out to the public. We did 100 meetings while we were iteratively developing the vision. We had the designs would be developed kind of iteratively over those sort of 3 or 4 months. And then when it went out to the public, it received 80% support. So that's a really good sort of outcome. BOFAS has looked at this in the last year with the council to sort of look at how infrastructure could work within Bridge Street. It's not as easy as dumping all the pipes in a common trench. And then we're also this sort of, so that was all great. And now we're at this point where we're in this sort of recovery. And I think this is a slide from 2011 on the road between the airport and the city center. And you know, these massive slips that are happening. And we had the big weather event here last August, more of these slips, more flooding. It is happening. On top of that is sort of decisions by council not to do certain projects. So that cool library project seems to have been shelved. And then a science and tech complex that would be 1,000 new knowledge workers was also sort of dropped off the list. So that's a bit defeating. And I guess for me, it's working back with our community of artists, the resilient people. Ann Rush at Makeshift Spaces, we kind of seed funded that and got that as a sort of a charitable organization. And they're doing these installations. They were in empty shops, but we're finding there isn't a lot of vacancies in shops. So now a lot of that's being used to do curatorial sort of programs of artworks that are from the Suter Gallery, or even in doing work for seismic affected buildings like you see in the upper right. Working with Our Lotus, bringing artwork and art activity within the central city has been a big objective, working with that community. Also bringing our festivals and events into the city center. So the Nelson Arts Festival, which happens in October, the Mask Parade, these things are happening in our city. To Ramaroa, the Light Nelson, this is a great event that'll happen in July, and this is that Upper Trafalgar on the right side of the slide. Last slide. What this leads to is opportunity. We haven't got the money, so we've got to be smart. We've got to be innovative. Having those plans, those strategies have attracted $36 million from central government. Working with our local artists, working with our iwi partners, coming up with a way of creating a new type of identity that might have been lost through the number of years. This is the opportunity to move forward in Nelson. So I thank you very much.